pleased to introduce the first speaker of the day, Laura Dabbish, who's an associate professor at the Human-Computer Interactions Institute at the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon, with also has appointments in the Heinz College of Public Policy and Information Systems and Management. We're talking about kind of interesting, fun facts to share, and surrounded in this room full of kind of odd collections of things. Laura gave me 3 descriptions of things that she has collected, some of which are in various places in this room, 2 of which are true and 1 of which is a lie. You can guess. You may notice the small bell collection on the back. Laura said she once collected bells when she was younger. She also collected agate and also collected rabbit's feet. And you can guess which one of those is no, 2 of those are true. One of them is, that's right. So. She did collect bells. So it's now a 50-50 chance.
Second guess.
Rabbits. She did collect rabbits.
You think that was true?
She did.
Yeah. That's gruesome.
I don't know if it's true or not.
Oh, am I supposed to say whether?
Yeah.
Leave you guessing till the end. I'll reveal it at the end.
Whatever you like. Just don't forget.
Am I a rabbit killer or not? Oh.
Or you just really the monster like rocks.
Right.
Just like rocks. Yeah. It's true. I collected agate. I would. Rabbit's feet is kind of. No offense to any rabbit feet collectors in this room. No offense. They are lucky. I had at least one probably. So. Okay. So hello. My name is Laura Dabbish. As Mako said, I'm jointly appointed in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon and the Heinz College of Public Policy and Information Systems Management, meaning I care both about the design of technology, but also its use and social consequences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, hopefully, all of that today. So my talk is entitled Transparency in Open Collaboration Environments. We've been thinking about peer production a lot, but not as much about the setting in which it happens. And so I'm going to try to focus our attention on the environment in which peer production, open collaboration happens. And I want to start out, because I'm focusing on transparency, with a quote by George Simmel, and also because I'm among networks researchers here, who thought about transparency. I don't know if most network folks are aware of this, but he has this great quote that says, if there is such a thing as complete reciprocal transparency, the relationships of human beings to each other would be modified in a quite unimaginable fashion. So this is a great quote that one of my collaborators, Colleen Stewart, found. And I don't know if this is what Simmel was thinking when he said this, but he may have been incredibly prescient about what's happening in our society today. So if you look around us, all kinds of social tools and technologies are giving us transparency or visibility about each other's actions at different levels. They're letting us make others aware of what we're doing on a moment-by-moment basis. We can share our location, our activities, what we're looking at to kind of decorate our home. We can share, minute details of our lives. And this is a form of transparency. We're giving each other, we're using these tools to give each other incredible deep visibility into our lives. But the question is, what happens when these kinds of tools, this social media, is connected to the work we're doing, to work artifacts? And so if we think about transparency in organizational life, transparency, for an organization, a collection of people trying to accomplish some work, can be thought of as this accurate observability of an organization's low-level activities, routines, behaviors, output, and performance. So it's awareness of others' work at some level, and it can also be thought of as an attribute of the work environment that workers are in, participants in an organization are in. And it has important implications for organizational life because the kind of the often unadulterated information it can make visible to other participants. So if you think about transparency as an aspect of a work environment or a organizational setting, we can think about like a co-located work environment. Like this is an open office environment, and all of the things that you just get to know by being physically co-present with the people you're working with. You have this ability to observe and overhear what they're working on, to get this kind of sense of what's going on around you, just by being in the same place at the same time. And we know from organizational psychology research on coordination that kind of observability of others' behaviors lets you infer things about the people you're working with, about kind of the hierarchy, say status levels among the different people you're working with, that helps you coordinate with them. So some nice work by Beth Betschke on coordination in film crews shows how they're able to, just by observing each other's actions, really understand a lot about someone's expertise and their roles and their status in the broader community. But when we think about peer production environments, we're talking about kind of a different kind of work environment and perhaps a different type of transparency. In kind of peer production environments or online, any kind of online work environments, you can have different levels of digital transparency in terms of your visibility of what other people have done in the system. So in an online environment, users can follow the activities of other people and their actions on artifacts. One of these online environments we've spent some time already in this workshop talking about is Wikipedia. It's a collaborative work environment. It's a good example of a collaborative work environment with high transparency at some level. So in Wikipedia, you get this detailed trace of actions on shared work artifacts, on articles. And through this kind of history of edit actions, you can know things about kind of how this article evolved to become in its current state, right? So you know who acted on it, when, what change they made, and you can start to understand things about how it got into its current state from that history. But there are other kind of aspects of the activity that's not necessarily recorded or visible here. But here I'm just talking about the technology of transparency at some level. So because Wikipedia records edits, because there are these options, as Mako and Aaron kind of looked at, of you can sign in or not. You get different levels of visibility of who did what in the system. And you can provide in these systems different levels of visibility about who looked at what, for example. So if we think about networks and communication interactions among people and what these systems actually afford or provide, we can think kind of about the kind of old school Shannon model of communication, where we have a source and a receiver, and information is going between them. And that's kind of what we used to know about communication before the internet, before we could kind of talk to anyone at any time, have information shared between lots of people at the same time. And information, we think about that kind of interaction as like, okay, information is going between a sender and receiver, and the receiver is giving some feedback either through like not observable nonverbal cues or direct communication that they understood or received that information. But when you move online and you're thinking about digital work environments, it's a totally different kind of model. So we have a source disseminating information. If we think about the work artifact as a piece of information, they're kind of putting it in a public place where lots of people can access that information. And then they can get feedback about even just that access action. They can know, how many people have viewed this piece of information, how many people are acting on this piece of information, what actions are they taking on it. So that's kind of the attempt to conceptualize a little bit the transparency that's available in these environments. So we have people, we have information artifacts, and we have their actions on those artifacts, and then we also have this kind of second level where we have visibility of those actions that can be turned on and off. And I'm citing a paper here where we tried to start to think about all of the dimensions of these kinds of systems that a designer could play with that might then affect the kind of social actions that are possible by participants in these systems. So because they're able to say, for example, know who the source of an information, piece of information is or not. I was excited to see that the research that Mako and Aaron presented that is starting to help us really formalize the extent to which those dimensions of the system affect participation or behavior or contribution levels. So we can start to think about parameterizing at some level the technological transparency that's available in a peer production system. If we think about social media as a transparency tool, it has these nice affordances. So it lets users articulate an interest network of people and artifacts they care about, and receive updates on actions by those people or on those artifacts. And so it gives transparency about other people's activities through the kind of tools or features that the systems have, right? So this is where the kind of line between the sort of technology of transparency and the behaviors or practices of transparency start to get blurred. But that the participants in the system are themselves kind of articulating what are they interested in, what do they care about. They're using the tool to kind of say, okay, I want to follow these people because the information they're creating is useful to me at some level. But that network itself, becomes an artifact and part of the tool. So you can see kind of who is kind of interested in what are they following or caring about, what artifacts are they acting on. It's all kind of becomes an artifact itself, and that's where it starts to also get pretty meta. But okay, so these tools at some level are affording transparency in the form of visibility of actions by other people. So we can think about this line I'm trying to draw a little bit between the technology of the transparency and the actions people take based on it. So transparent tools kind of afford this much broader information access of people's work process and product. They let you share kind of the work product and process at a much deeper level than was previously possible. So there's a lot of potential there, but there's this unique kind of social challenges that come up when you're doing that in an open collaboration setting. So these aren't kind of transparency tools in a vacuum, if you will. This is a social setting, and there are kind of social issues that are surrounding like the information that's being generated and used. So there are multiple stakeholders with disparate interests and desires. We heard about conflict in the very first talk that opened this entire session, right? So the kind of conflict that's visible in a system, an open collaboration system like Wikipedia is kind of evidence of this underlying cultural differences or perspectives that people have about some issue, right? And that's kind of getting expressed in the system through what you're able to observe, through the activities and interactions people are taking in the system. But it makes the kind of power of transparency for coordination and collaboration maybe limited at some level. So there are these social challenges to kind of realizing the potential of complete transparency in these systems. Transparency, the technology is being used in a setting where there's multiple stakeholders with disparate interests and desires, and there are social and political reasons to hide or share information in that kind of environment where there's potential for conflict, where you may not have aligned interests with all the parties involved. We also know that people, when they're acting in public and there's a record of their behavior, or even when there's not necessarily a record of their behavior, they manipulate their actions, to communicate certain information. So it's not that we're just seeing this kind of very pure, unadulterated, somehow like information processing that's happening on the kinds of things that are being shared, right? It's kind of surrounded by these social and cultural considerations that affect the way you're going to use transparency to get the work done. Okay, so what we wanted to understand and what I've been trying to look at is how do people kind of co-opt and adopt and appropriate the technology of transparency to kind of support their work. So how do they use it to support sometimes conflicting and emergent and dynamic needs in an open collaboration setting? So when you have multiple stakeholders, people with different interests, kind of all collaborating, contributing in the same place, what are they doing with these tools that can provide different levels of information about what their actions are, what they care about, what they're doing? So what practices emerge in this kind of setting to increase or limit openness? How does the technology of transparency interact with a culture of openness, specifically in open source software development? And what kind of social and political and cultural factors support cross-project coordination, specifically in a transparent, open collaboration environment? Okay, so I want to kind of zoom in on one behavior, and specifically that we focused on in some of the research that I'm doing, looking at transparency and collaboration in an open environment, and that's coordination specifically. So I talked about the potential for transparency to support coordination, this ability to kind of overhear and oversee what people are doing. But what does coordination look like in a transparent, open collaboration environment? So what I kind of want to do with the rest of the time I have is zoom in to give you some richer descriptions of behavior, of how transparency was appropriated in one environment, and then zoom out to think about the role of a collaboration platform in peer production more broadly, and try, if I can, to connect with some of the ideas that Yochai brought up last night. So I will make some attempt to try to follow, although it is a difficult act to follow, but yes. Okay, so let me first zoom in a bit to tell you about what we've observed in one particular setting, in terms of how work got done, and how people appropriated this kind of technology that was available to them in this environment to coordinate their work activities. So the setting that we that I and my collaborators have spent a lot of time looking at is GitHub. And so hopefully most of you are familiar with GitHub. I'll give a very brief description of it so you have a sense of what it is and why we found it interesting. But GitHub is an online, it's a website, effectively, that hosts software repositories. And it has an incredible number of software repositories there available. So there are at least 5.9 million public repositories hosted on GitHub. There are there's also the ability to have private repositories, but here I'm focusing just on the publicly visible behavior that happens on the site. So there are a lot of public repositories that users have posted, and there are over 3.4 million registered users, and these users, there's more users every day, so the last count that I was able to get suggests there are 10,000 new users each day, and they're adding 20,000 new repositories a day, and there are at least 80,000 code commits happening per day. So the scale of this environment was one of the reasons that we found it particularly interesting. So when you have a setting where all of the activity is kind of publicly visible, being recorded and archived and then presented on this kind of site, and you have any reasonable number of people acting in that setting, scale becomes an issue. And understanding kind of what other people are even doing in this kind of site, navigating this kind of site is a huge challenge. This is an issue Charlie brought up in his talk as well, I think. You're looking at me like, no.
No, I was touching on it.
Okay, yeah, so, okay.
Sorry.
No, it's cool. So, yeah, so it's huge, and there's a lot going on there. So I want to give you a sense of what it looks like from a participant's perspective. So on the site, participants have profiles where they can choose to provide different levels of information about themselves. There's a norm of providing your real name and your photo. So if you have an account, your real name identified. People, for the most part. There are also accounts that are organizations, but they link back to individuals at some level. And on your profile, you can provide, like I said, different information about yourself, like your website, your email, and then you can also have visible the repositories that you've contributed to, also the repositories that you yourself own, that you put on the site, and you have control effectively over the contributions that go in them, you can kind of drill down to get more information about levels of activity within these different repositories. So there are kind of little visualizations of like, okay, how much has he been coding in each of these? How many people are kind of paying attention to these repositories, like that have started them? How many people are also kind of working on them or making edits to them, meaning how many people have created a fork of those repositories, like created their own copy of that repository. So I highlighted the personal information, the repositories, and then if you fork a repository or you're watching it, you get a feed of actions on that repository. So you can get essentially a moment-by-moment updates about other contributors' changes to that repository and their communications around those changes. Also issues that are submitted. You get basically updates about what's going on. The other aspect of the site I want to point out is that you can watch if someone creates a personal copy of your repository. To the extent that they share the changes with you, you can get a kind of overview of the kinds of changes that they're making to these forked versions, they call them, of your repository. So this is a little scenario animation that I created to kind of illustrate this. So if Sam Stevenson, the user that I was focusing on, has a repository called Stitch, someone forks it, he can kind of see that they forked it, and then once they start adding code, he can see those commits going in, and then they can ask him to take those changes back in, and he can make the decision of whether or not to merge those changes, those edits, into his original project. So there's this level of central control over the changes that go into each project, although they are all publicly visible and you can create your own copy. And then other people can come along and create their own copies or of that repository, be making changes to those copies, and then new people can come along and make their own copy of the new version with all of this mguts users changes. This is the kind of overview that an owner can get of who is making what changes to their repository. This overview is also visible to all of these contributors, so they can see who else is working on this same project. Okay, so this is just to give you guys a sense of what people can see, what's going on in the site. So we talked to users of the site. We did a lot of interviewing of members of GitHub to try to understand what they do there, how they interpret the information that they get about other people's actions in this setting, and how they manage their projects and coordinate across projects. So when they get a submission from a stranger that they may not know, someone like mguts, how are they making this decision of whether to take this code into their project? What kind of information are they looking at to understand who that person is? And just in general, what does activity look like there? I'm going to tell you about results from a set of interviews that focused on coordination, but we've also followed up to look at impression formation and impression management and other aspects of participation, like commenting dynamics and contribution, the kind of conversations that happen around contributions. So we interviewed 50 members of GitHub to understand coordination. These were, obviously different kinds of users, big projects, small projects, hobbyists, people who are paid to contribute to open source, to get a broad set of information about what's going on, focusing on recent activity in this site and project management, and kind of open coded their responses to understand how they use information to coordinate, and really focused on coordination instances where contributions were coming from across projects. And we found that coordination in this setting, as in all settings really where coordination happens, it's a temporal process that where projects are constantly in motion, they're unfolding over time. But what's interesting about what's happening here is how the transparency, the information and accountability you get from your changes being visible and there being this public record of your changes helped project members become more aware of key decision points in the projects that they depended on. And then also make others aware about the changes that they were thinking about or about to do in a different way. And having an audience for their work kind of motivated a different kind of action. So it helped people kind of more readily understand the changes that were going to happen. But what I really I kind of want to center this on is all of the things that happened before a conflict arose that made it so that coordination was just much smoother. Effectively, conflicts were handled earlier than they would be without transparency, is what we observed. So the thing that I want to highlight, the pre-coordination behaviors or practices that happened that seemed to be kind of before or in anticipation of a conflict. So lots of activity here happened because there was this potential for anyone to engage with your project at any point in time. And that's part of this characteristic of these open environments, right? That they're fluid, the boundary, there's not a firm boundary of like who could potentially see or use your work. And you want to make it so that anyone can potentially join, anyone can potentially use what you're making. That was in the mind of contributors as they're acting in that setting. But there's also this role of the platform in standardizing behavior. So in terms of contribution practices, the way that people created and edited their work, but also the way that they were able to submit changes to each other. Okay, so what we saw was that the technology kind of afforded two classes of pre-coordination behaviors. So if we think about the technology in that system being things like public copies and edits, feeds, the network that I showed you guys, it afforded information-seeking practices. So participants in the setting could scout for projects. They could kind of figure out which projects were more or less kind of optimal for them to depend on, and also which projects were more or less kind of fitting their needs and interests, because they had this much deeper view of the dynamics of the project and what was going on there. And then it afforded monitoring in terms of this deeper view of the interaction and the kind of unfolding of these project trajectories. So I'll just really briefly mention or describe both of these behaviors. So scouting, developers here were using this aggregate, these traces of project activity to assess credibility of the project and future potential. And they did this both for projects and for people. So they would look at kind of how, what kind of volume of commits or changes is happening in this project? What's the kind of trajectory in terms of like, are they ramping up? Are they slowing down? And so is this project like stable for me to use? Is it kind of moving in a direction that I want, in terms of the kinds of changes they're making? Is this consistent with what I need? And so they were able to do that just by looking around in the environment to see, okay, is this something that I want to depend on? But also kind of keeping tabs on projects that seemed promising for their use. So a library that seemed like it would suit a particular need that they had, but had just started development or was in early stages, versus a library that was much farther along and mature, but hadn't had a lot of activity for a while. Those were both the kind of projects that people would keep tabs on to see, okay, is it going to become live again, or is this new project going to mature and become stable? I probably don't have time for this, but I have some quotes from different participants about, the kind of things they looked for, like, are there changes going in? How recent are the changes? Like weeks, months, years? What's the mix of contributors? Is it all one person doing everything? Is it all people in a single organization? Is it a wide group of people? So kind of what kind of project is this in terms of the demographic, the composition of this project? The wider the net, there's more likelihood any issue I might run into has already been identified. So they're looking at who are the different kinds of users of this project, and is this what I actually need? And then they also would kind of monitor or keep track of their dependencies, both upstream dependencies, meaning the projects that they used in their own work, where users here means that they're using the software in their own software. So they're depending on that project, and the changes that that project makes will affect the functionality of their own project. So if you remember this network view I showed you, the project owners could also look at this for people who were depending on their project. So the people who forked their project a lot of times were users who were making changes because the project had certain bugs or wasn't compatible with other kinds of dependencies that they had. And so this view would give them an overview of everything that was going on in these kind of changes. So they could actually hover over the commits and see someone's commit message and then kind of go to it and see what the change was. And so they could see the kind of their user needs effectively. So what does the community need from my project? What are they doing with it to try to make it into what they want? And so you can imagine this kind of visibility for the kinds of projects like Jeff was talking about. If you think about, well, how would you actuate physical objects in the world, or try to figure out the kinds of adaptations that people are making to these CAD diagrams and why. But okay, so we saw them talking about using this to assess user needs and then enhance their own project in anticipation of the kinds of changes that lots of people needed. So this is one example of that. I saw someone trying to use my project with the Rails master. I'm like, well, crap, I don't know if it works with the Rails master, so let me check. So that kind of stuff has been useful just to get a sense of the kind of things people might like to see. So they kind of were watching what people were doing with their project, also watching projects they depended on to figure out what kind of changes would be problematic for them, so what's coming down the pike. And using that feed, they could see things like, okay, somebody pushed to the master a bunch of new changes. Let me go look at those changes, especially if they're in a file that's related to what I'm doing. So if there's something in the feed, if they saw something in the feed that would preclude a feature that I would want, it would give me a chance to add input to it. So if they saw kind of changes coming that were suggesting a certain trajectory, they could comment on those changes and interact on them much earlier than they would be able to in a closed environment where the development is happening behind a wall that no one can kind of access. Okay, so that's kind of pre-coordination. Then we also saw that pre-coordination, these information-seeking practices were facilitated by expressive action practices that the participants kind of engaged in. So there are features of the technology that really afforded more expressive action. So having flexible change granularity, they could really decide this is what a change is. Like these are 3 edits that I made. This is the change that you should care about. Versus like these 20 edits, that change size could vary, and the comments on those changes could be public, so they could have kind of audience feedback about their actions. And so there's this real component in these environments of being on stage, performing your work for an audience that you have some awareness of their identity, but it's kind of this invisible audience that you're imagining. So it's very akin to, some of the, it definitely connects to the Goffman about audience and audience practices, but here your audience is not known because you're doing it in this setting where anyone could show up and watch you. So the participants talked about being on stage, this feeling of being on stage when you're working, that there's this pressure to working in public. So commit level, broadcasts created this kind of detailed process visibility if they, did them in a way that communicated intent. So just by having that record of actions alone, that wasn't enough. It was about the way that they kind of packaged those actions to really demonstrate what the intention was behind it. So by making a change a certain size and creating a certain commit message, that kind of made that action legible at a low level and at a higher level when you could see kind of a chain of actions in sequence. So just to give you guys an example of that, this is an addition of code to a public repository called ThinkUp, owned by a user, Gina Trappini. And in this change, all she's doing, this is the most basic, simple, nothing complicated here, but all she's doing here is effectively commenting out 2 lines of code. But she adds this commit message, to this change that explains why is she doing this. So avoid test failures based on variable time zone support. So at the top of the page, we can see that commit message where she's stating why she made that change. And the site itself has this feature where it's showing you what was changed, right, to the original code. So instead of just revealing your work when it's complete, you're revealing it, like this. That little incident is public. And you can imagine, for all of you, what it would be like if every time that you edited a sentence in your Word document, every time you edited a slide in your PowerPoint presentation, that could become public. So what kind of commit message are you going to add to that edit? So you're not just showing the end product, but the process of work is being revealed. The sausage making, if you will, is showing. So this kind of created a norm in the site to convey the rationale, the change rationale, along with the change. So messages that kind of correspond to your unitary commits. So the quote from one of our participants kind of illustrates that perception and the pressure that comes along with it. So I try and make sure my commit messages are snappy and that my code is clean, because I know that a lot of people are watching. So this is on a bigger project. It's like being on stage. You don't want to mess up. You're giving it your best. You've got your Hollywood smile. So they're aware of that visibility. And there was a norm that developed that commits should be granular and tell a story of the change that you're trying to make. We heard this over and over again, that commits should tell a story. So not just that low level of, okay, this message is communicating my intent, but also the ordering in which I'm doing those changes. And so it created this desire to communicate why you're doing what you're doing with that sequence of actions. This was also motivated by the fact that if you were working on someone else's project and you were going to submit those changes to them, it had to be very apparent to them why you were making those changes. So what were you trying to do with their project? What reason did they have to accept this set of changes? And they could really just see that at this high level. So we saw a lot of cases of people getting, newcomers getting their code changes kicked back to them if they were too many commits in them, it wasn't kind of clean and clear and showing, oh, this is what I'm doing with your code. Because there was this expectation that you have to tell me why I should take what you're taking. So interesting kind of power issues there as well. Okay, so I highlighted these pre-coordination behaviors that the kind of technology of transparency afforded, or what I'm calling it, the technology on the left side, the social tools afforded. So it really, the way that people work to make their work understandable and visible at key points in time and legible to certain audiences that they had in mind, those were really key into leveraging the tools to make work understandable, to facilitate coordination. And the place where I kind of want to try, if I can, to bring it back to some of the points that were raised last night and throughout the conversation yesterday, is to start to think about the platform that these participants are working through, and what is it allowing people to do. And so what saw really here is one of the key features of this platform, in addition to the central, control or some more central control over project changes at the project level, there was this common language of contribution. It sort of went hand in hand with that. So there were projects, that owners, why does it do that? Projects that owners could control the changes to, but it was all kind of hosted in this platform where the language of contribution was standardized. So there's this, structure effectively supported by the infrastructure, like this GitHub site of, how do you change the code? How do you talk about the code? The commenting kind of functionality. So it let you talk about the code in a way that was much more localized to the detailed changes and actions you're taking. You could comment on a specific line of code. That's where comments happen. They happen on an issue. They're kind of happening at this very low level, but very connected with the actions. And then it also kind of supported a certain way of thinking about changing the code, in terms of how granular you could actually make your changes, and what kind of expectations there were about adding a comment. So even just having that field that was, okay, here's your comment that you're supposed to add with your commit, that's really structuring your action in a way that is, kind of leading you to say, okay, I should explain myself. It's so salient and prominent here. So within that structure, people are doing their work to make things understandable, more or less understandable. And they themselves can see that structure, right? So they can see the way that other people are using it. And so that it becomes this kind of language that is kind of encapsulated in the site, but also afforded by the features of it. Okay, so we've also looked at how that platform is co-opted to do practices around project management and participation, change management and acceptance, and impression formation. I kind of alluded a little bit to some of the results when I was talking about details of the behaviors in the site. But at the higher level, I see this reveal just kills my little animation. So maybe my talk title should have been, collaboration platforms, because the transparency, it's not inherent in the platform, right? It's really about what the participants are doing with the technology to make their work more understandable broadly and legible to each other. So they're trying to make their action more transparent, and they have choices about how and when to make changes visible. So it's not that the system is just pushing every change. They can decide, okay, now I'm ready to show all these changes to the world. They can work, there's a capability to work completely in the site and make everything visible immediately, but there's also capability to take everything down to your own machine, make your edits, and then, kind of put those edits up. And that's possible in a lot of these open collaboration systems. But here, the way that the kind of personal tools you have to make those changes work, they kind of keep that record. Okay, here's all the edits, and give you this capability to change that window of, okay, these are the ones that are important for everyone to see, and this is why. So, okay, if we think about collaboration platforms, we think about kind of all the people participating in, both open collaboration platforms, more closed or variously open at different levels collaboration platforms. I want to bring the attention, at least of this group, to start thinking more about what are the features of those platforms, and how are they appropriated, how do they interact with the social structures that already exist, how do they shape the social structures that then evolve inside of the platform, across different platforms, the ecosystem of collaboration here. So at the very basic level, what do these platforms even look like? But then what kind of future of work are we designing through these platforms? It's not a question anymore of whether our work is going to happen through these kinds of platforms. It's happening, right? So what is the kind of future of work that peer production can, inform, that is more, sustainable, better for the participants that are engaged, open, and kind of most effective, if we can be so grand to think about those things. And I want to claim that the platform is at the center of this. We have to think about what's going on here. So who owns it? What affordances are there? Who owns the data? What data can you see about who's doing what? What options do you give participants about what they know about what's going on? So maybe we should instead be thinking, okay, what's the future of work? And how can we make that future better by what we know about what works well and doesn't work well in peer production? That's basically, if I understood it, the question that you were raising. Maybe you were raising that question, Yokai, yesterday. So I'll just claim that that's the question you're raising. So if we think about that, is peer production the future of work? What kind of future is it? What kind of future can it be? So we have kind of on the one hand, or I want to try to make this dichotomy. On the one hand, we have the collective. That's kind of the systems that we've been talking about, these open, variously open systems like Wikipedia and open source software where everyone can see everything, contribute to information artifacts that are publicly available, and maybe every action on those artifacts is visible, and this kind of super transparent. And that kind of organization, this aligns with I try to align it with this more humanistic kind of your right column on, so the kind of socially embedded social actors kind of stuff. Okay, so on the right side though, there's this other feature that's possible, very real, coming quickly. If we don't do something about it, that is, or maybe it's fine, but that is the crowd, right? So this is an alternative peer production kind of feature of work, but it has a lot of advantages for a lot of reasons when you think about it that way. So I want to kind of try to contrast very briefly in my last remaining moments these two futures of work, if I can, and think about what we can say about them. How do we get from this to that? You know, are there things we can learn from the crowd work kind of paradigm, crowdsourcing paradigm, that we could bring, you know, into peer production and vice versa to make it more efficient? How can thinking about transparency or what, you know, how actors kind of use it help us? Okay, so that's a big agenda for like 2 minutes. Okay, so let me imagine, if you will, two alternative futures that are inspired by the two kind of paradigms that Yochai was contrasting. Okay, so the one feature is this kind of post-currency collective. It's the Star Trek feature, if you will, where we don't have money anymore. We kind of just are working on things at a more discretionary basis to further human knowledge, and we replicate goods when we need them. That's kind of maybe that's sort of akin. So that's the open collaboration, the best case. And you know, here when we're researching this, we're thinking, okay, how can we turn these kind of systems into actually sustainable systems where, you know, we can either produce goods that are sold for money, or somehow it's going to connect up better with the larger, I guess, markets and government. And I'm not an institutional theorist, so I'm gonna let you guys think about that more. But so there's that future, and the thing, you know, that's nice about it is, okay, so the open collaboration connects with the kind of way that we know very complex knowledge-based work gets done, right? So if we start to provide more tools and more visibility and help kind of actors coordinate, the interesting challenges there become, you know, scale and overload and kind of helping people find the knowledge they need when they need it. And there's huge potential for tools like the kind of transparent platforms that I'm talking about to do things like encode knowledge in the platform, you know, by supporting these practices around expressive action and information seeking to help, you know, form dependencies and match with the right collaborators and projects through what you can see in the environment. But on the other side, we have the crowd. So this is a 1984 screen cap to kind of say that this is kind of what's happening in the online crowdsourced workspaces. So the part of what I guess the value of the crowd is, we can say, okay, here are these things that we need help with, that we can describe really well, and we can farm out to a lot of people, and you know, we can kind of take their input and train algorithms that are going to make us more effective at this higher level, and then eventually get to the robot future where we don't have to do anything because we've trained all these robots to do all the things we know how to do so well, because we're measuring everything that people are doing in this system. And so we're starting with super simple tasks, you know, like editing out of the books, history books, all the mentions of Eurasian War. That's a very simple menial routine task, but we're going to scale up to, you know, science. We're going to solve science with this. We're going to solve everything with this. Okay, so that's a different view that is more what I might call it computational organizations. So we're seeing the workers, the participants in these systems as computation devices, and they are capable of certain computations, and we are going to just try to kind of translate and extract that computation from them. And so here we have humans training algorithms, and they're carrying out tasks that computers are learning to do by watching them. And so power is really centralized in the platform that's mediating the connection between the workers and the requesters. And there's little transparency for the participants in these systems of where their work is coming from, how they're being evaluated, the workflow. So the other key aspect of this is that you have to kind of constantly monitor and surveil what's going on. So here, transparency is being used, to kind of keep track, or maybe it's not transparency, but I should say recordability and archivability of work actions is being used to make sure that, okay, everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. The work is, how much are different people working? Who's the better worker? Oh yeah, this was just a screen cap to give you an example of what Winston is doing when he's done. But they're not getting a lot of cues about who else is around and what they're doing. And this is the crowdsourced workspace. So you do your task, you kind of show up, you figure out which task you're supposed to do, you do it, and then you drop your assignment in the tube, and then you go home. And you don't ask questions about where it's going. So you tag your images, you kind of say, okay, let me take this image and tag it with 5 labels that describe it, and then submit it back to the system. The thing is this is where you work for pay, and so I think a lot of the view in research is, okay, so that's because those people are doing it for pay. It's kind of evil and bad, and we're doing it for good things like science. So it's okay to do it this way, because to see workers, as these machines that are computation devices, because it's for their own good, it's for our own good, it's for the collective's good. We're limiting information access. That if they could see what each other is doing, that's going to hurt data quality. That's going to make the data less optimal. It's going to make the task output essentially at some level less optimal. So these are just 2 examples. So Zooniverse, which we all know and love, where people are kind of just saying, okay, this galaxy that I'm looking at, is it like this, or this? That's the task. It doesn't involve a huge amount of knowledge, but it's training an algorithm that will then do this on its own. And it's incredibly effective, and people love doing it because they're contributing to something bigger. So it's a little less, it feels less controlling. And then this is another example where they're doing that same kind of classification task. There are lots of examples of that. And so in that kind of genre, there's all these research directions around scaling up the crowd, moving to more complex tasks, like science, growing experts in the crowd, so taking these faceless, nameless people and making them really good at whatever it is, crowd innovation, like how can we kind of get smart stuff out of these crowds, more interesting work, basically, creating quick response teams within the crowd. And if it's being used for good, we all like it. But yeah, so I dabbled in this myself, so I can't, kind of claim that I'm not, also guilty of viewing humans this way, but I sort of expose a little bit maybe the ridiculousness of that. So these, the ESP game and games with a purpose, that's sort of an example, right? Where here we're giving people something that they would want to do anyway. They would be playing these casual games on their phone, kind of just wasting time, and instead we're getting useful information and work out of it. And so maybe then it's okay. But then when we start to look at systems like Facebook, people are getting what they want, out of these systems too, and we're getting good data out of it, and it's not okay. So I guess I'm trying to raise this issue of ethics in peer production and crowdsourcing in terms of how much participants should know or need to know about where is their work going, what is it that they are training, what kind of algorithm are they training, what is their role in this system, and is this the future we want to turn into? So is it okay that if everybody's like kind of happy and feeling satisfied that it's okay. Yeah, so we kind of dabbled a little bit in trying to provide more visibility of the workflow and see what that does in terms of like how it affects worker motivation and data quality and some of the kind of weird things that happen when you start to have some visibility of other participants and not others. So weird things like just knowing activity history about another person increases their credibility, even when it's not relevant to the task, and when it shows better or worse things. We can kind of tune your we can affect who you think is credible and who's not, and how you present someone's work history affects like how you perceive their competence, whether you affect their work, whether you're willing to edit it. So knowing just a little bit about someone can really change the way you treat them. Okay, and so the last thing I want to point out is, okay, but in both of these platforms, we also have to be careful about how we're using, or both of these kinds of work. How are we using kind of tracking and sensing capabilities to do things like optimizing workers, optimizing teams and relationships among people, this has like new privacy challenges that these kind of settings present, and is it leading to this automated future where we're kind of training our replacements? So we've been also trying to think about what it means to have algorithms in that workflow process a little bit. So how does it feel from the participant perspective to be managed by an algorithm? How do they make sense of those systems? So in platforms like Uber and Lyft, how do they understand kind of how work is getting assigned? How do they try to kind of take control of their work at some level? What strategies do they form to kind of optimize behavior in the system? How do they work together around the system to try to learn how to do things and improve in their work? Okay. I guess I'll come back to this slide to leave it up if there's any time for discussion about what is the role of the network in all of this. So we haven't really heard a lot about networks in our conversation. We kind of started with some networks, but what I'm trying to, I guess, describe here through thinking about the platform and the artifacts that people are producing, those are both players in this kind of entire system. And we can think about new kinds of networks here. So what kind of networks are important? We have new networks like networks between people and artifacts, these networks about the changes and edits people are making, and then networks of people to those because people are talking about those changes and interacting around them. So I think there's a lot of new kinds of networks that we haven't really thought about or don't know how to think about. And there's questions about who gets to know the network. So the platform being something that can be more or less opaque and can be owned and controlled, and the data in it being, can be owned and controlled. Who gets to see that network of interactions among people? Should it be available to everyone? How does knowing the network actually help you? So if you know the network, does it still give you the same kinds of performance advantages in these different kinds of systems? So even in these kind of Orwellian crowdsourced systems, there are networks of direct interaction that's happening around them. So it's not a vacuum. It's not the pure vacuum that Orwell would want, right? There's sort of Turk-Opticon where Turkers are talking, or like Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft drivers are organizing on Facebook. They're using other systems, so there's other networks that might not be in the platform. And yeah, so do the same structures matter? Okay, so that's I guess I'll stop there. So I think we have to really look carefully at how we're designing these online work environments and what kind of impact they have on the participants. But can we think more carefully about that interplay between the platform design and the social practices that evolve around it? And is there a way that we as a research collective can come up with a science of peer production platform design that is both sustainable, engaging and meaningful for the participants, but also financially sustainable as well as just contribution sustainable. Okay, so I want to just mention my collaborators in this work because they're great people. All of these guys, some of you guys may know them, and thank all of you and mention the folks who've supported this work, including the NSF. So yeah, hopefully there's time to talk a little bit now.
Yeah, and we started a little bit late, so there's time for some questions. So yeah.
I just wanted to say I really enjoyed your talk, and your point about understanding these collaborative systems totally connects to what I was trying to say yesterday in terms of these functions. In a way, if you've got a function that creates some new transparency, that's really an operational rule, and it makes me think back to Lawrence Lessig's points about code is law. And so I'm just supporting what you're saying, because we really, if you're going to compare, for instance, SourceForge and GitHub, there are clearly differences in the transparency that's shown of what the user's doing and other things. And these are rules that have been decided to do. And so I continue to puzzle about how the research community moves forward to try to study these rule systems in a really systematic way that can take advantage of the computational stuff. And the last thing I'll say is, right now I'm actually collaborating with 2 other people on a course, and we're using Gitbook. So when you were showing those functions about edits, I don't even know whether that Gitbook has those functions, but we're very rapidly moving to these same kinds of tools in writing, as you were suggesting.
Cool. Yeah, that's actually just, I guess to briefly say, I think that's a place where, yeah, it might be useful to think about like how do some of the things that, or that's something that we've been trying to think about is how do the things we see happening in GitHub translate to other kinds of work and other kinds of settings like Wikipedia, like what are the key aspects of that system?
Hello, thank you for your talk. It's really interesting. Actually, I really hope that by being more transparent, our collaboration will be promoted. But I'm wondering, to what extent do you think the transparency's positive effect can be generalized to other forms of peer production? Because to me, coding is a very particular type of task in which, to the extent that people have there's a clearer standard of whether the code can work efficiently or not, and then the developer community is a very particular community in which there's a shared norm of sharing, and people seem to share the goal of making the code more, effective. But in other forms, say Wikipedia, when it involves the integration of different perspectives or interests, I don't think, it seems to me that just by revealing what people actually think or do would erase those conflicts. So I'm wondering, what you think.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, set of points that you just made around what's unique about software and this setting in particular versus, like Wikipedia, or would this translate? And I think that the kind of norms in coding around well, first of all, the fact that everybody who's participating in this site at some level is engaging in the same kind of activity is really important, because that makes them able to understand what each other is doing. And that's not always true in other kinds of work or other kinds of peer production where there can be varied contribution, right? You could, have different kinds of roles or different ways, like citizen science is, I guess, an example where you could think about the person designing a study versus the person collecting the data. Those are totally different roles, and maybe they need different levels of knowledge and information about what's going on. But the other one, I think, important thing you raised was evaluating the quality of contribution. So that is I think is super important here, that there is some, I guess, what do you call it? Not like a objective measure of what whether some code works or not, right? So does it pass some tests? And that even comes into play. So people don't always submit evidence that their code is, good, and that's something where there's different social practices even around that, and they have to kind of force someone to prove that your code even works. But then it starts to get, I guess, interesting when the contributions are less provably correct. That's where transparency still matters a lot, like in this setting, and also where, I guess, the practices around it are very important. So when your contribution is more complex, it has kind of more elements, so it's not so obvious that, oh, this is a change. It's not, how is this going to affect my project, basically? If it's not obvious, then I can start to, kind of give you reasons for not accepting it that you can never, kind of argue against. So if I'm the owner, if this doesn't fit with my vision of where the project is going, you can't really argue with that. I think it would be really interesting to see the kinds of, we've looked a bit at the kinds of arguments and reasoning, like the discussions that happen around contributions in GitHub, and it would be interesting to compare that with the kinds of discussions that happen around contributions in Wikipedia. I'm not as familiar with the details of the different kinds of rationale people give for a change being good or bad, but I think there's definitely parallels when you get into the subjective area of things. But here, because someone owns where the direction of the project, that's kind of used a lot to say this isn't yeah, anyway, there are contributions that aren't like so obviously good, I guess, if that answers that.
Okay, so, yeah, one last question.
Just wanted to make one comment about, me being biased by Wikimedia. You may want to look at basically the current dynamics around Wikipedia and Wikidata, which is the knowledge base for the Wikimedia movement. And basically Wikidata has become big enough right now that Wikipedia community is considering kind of to accept it as like, and the dynamics that you're talking about and the way these two projects kind of become closer or not, whether they merge, whether they become one thing, and what kind of information Wikipedians eventually will decide to choose from Wikidata, and what kind of information, how Wikidata will choose to change its behavior or not, and the way it produces knowledge would be something interesting to look at.
Mm-hmm. Cool, I'll definitely check
All
that
right,
out.
I think we should probably wrap up this session, but thank you all for that, and thank you again, Laura, for